Hello, I am not Edward Crichton, and I am the author of Edward Crichton's Praetorian series, starting with The Last Roman, Book 1 in the series. So welcome back. I hope you've stuck with me this long. If not, well, I guess you wouldn't be here and I wouldn't know. If you have stuck with me this long, I want to say thank you. I'm about to start reading the book in earnest now, get out of the prologue and start beginning with the real story. Two quick things to note, one housekeeping thing and one of my fun facts about myself and my writing. The housekeeping thing is maybe some of you enjoy reading along with me. I don't read very well out loud sometimes. I stumble over my words, and especially reading this book, I'll stumble over quite a bit. So if you don't want to listen to me reading the book, you're more than welcome to simply skip to the time codes where I talk about myself and the book and the writing process and all that fun stuff. So there should be the beginning of the video, there should be a time code for when I start reading, a time code for when I end reading, and then the end of the video. So you can always watch the whole thing, watch just my prattling on about myself, or you can listen to me prattling on in written form, or whatever you like to do. So that's the housekeeping rule. The second thing I wanted to talk real quick is probably the first thing that jumps out at people about this book, and that's that I wrote it in the first person. Why write a book in the first person, honestly? I can't really remember exactly why I chose to do it. Probably because I really connected with Jacob so much that I just kind of felt like he was like a outlet for myself, so it made sense to write it in the first person. But also, I think it was because I had just gotten done reading this book. Well, that's not true. I read it earlier in my life, but I'd reread it prior to writing my first book, and it's called The Icarus Hunt by Timothy Zahn from the 90s. Timothy Zahn wrote Star Wars Thrawn trilogy, which was a big deal back then. Still kind of is a big deal. There are still a lot of adherents to the story. I really loved that book back there, The Icarus Hunt. It's like a mystery in space, a lot of Starfarer inspirations going on there, and it was written in the first person. The main character, I really connected with him. I really enjoyed it, and I think that was the major inspiration for why I wrote in the first person. So that's like the most glaring thing you'll notice about my books and my writing, is that it's all in the first person. Even book 4, where I kind of tweak the setup a little bit, it makes sense if you've read it once we get to it. Not a major tweak, it's still in the first person, but just the perspectives is different. So that was a major influence on me back then. I read that book every few years, and I still really enjoy it. It's a self-contained novel, something people always criticize me for. It's like, oh, you just wrote the first book to make a series of books. Like, this doesn't have a concise, solid ending. And I argue that it kind of does. It does wrap up its own little story. It definitely sets things up, but it does kind of wrap up its own little story. Maybe one day I'll write a book that actually is its own concise story with its own little happy ending. I don't know. It seems difficult to me. That was actually my next goal after finishing that little novella of mine, Along the Path of Darkness. My goal was to write a self-contained story, independent of everything else I've ever done. Although nothing is technically independent of itself, of everything else, if you catch my drift. More on that way later. It's not really that original or anything, but anyways. So I'm going to start reading. I'm going to read for about 10 minutes. I've actually filmed this segment before, but I lost the video through my own stupidity. So I have read it, and I gotta admit, I've always known that I've been a long-winded writer. It's one of people's biggest complaints about my writing is that I'm long-winded and verbose, and I just go on, and it's true, especially in the beginning. I think towards the end of the series, my writing tightens up a little bit, if not my overall story. What goes on in the story is kind of long-winded. My sentence structure gets a little tighter. But in the first book, it's pretty bad sometimes. You're going to hear me stumble and trip over my own writing a number of times. It's because it's okay. I don't know. It's okay. It definitely gets a little long-winded, and I don't even know what I'm saying sometimes. But anyway, so I'm going to read for about 10 minutes. I'll find a good natural stopping place because there's plenty in this first chapter at least. And we'll go from there. We'll talk a little bit about some of the things in the story after that. Let me just get a quick sip of water. Okay, great. Okay. Part 1, Chapter 1, Hunter. C-130J Super Hercules II over the Mediterranean Sea, July 2021 AD. C-130J Super Hercules II aircraft have often been lauded as the smoothest ride in the sky. First deployed only a year ago, the Super Hercules II was the most advanced military aircraft on the planet, and after only a few months of active service, were practically considered luxury liners by those who flew in them. Unfortunately, the hurricane-type conditions currently surrounding my particular C-130J didn't care what people thought of them and proceeded to bounce and toss my plane around like any other aircraft. Even prior to the storm, the ride was no smoother than my first Halo combat drop out of an old C-130 over Palestine 3 years ago, or the countless times since. I'd long ago concluded that people who name these things really should fly in one every once in a while. Perspective was a wonderful thing, after all. I smirked at my wayward musings, my constant companion for years. They become a relentless presence in my life, a simple way to pass the time when nerves became most acute. While 5 years in the U.S. Navy, the last 3 of which I'd spent as an elite Navy SEAL, had extinguished any ability I may have once had to feel fear over something as mundane as a flight through a thunderstorm, that didn't mean I was completely steadfast. I could feel nervous before a mission and even anxious during them, but I was never totally afraid. Fear can compromise an operator's initiative or lock him up in the heat of battle, and that got people killed. The one thing that always hit a nerve, however, was the loss of control, like the fact that I knew that I couldn't do anything if something happened to the aircraft. I simply didn't possess the skill set required to help, and that made me feel helpless. Hence my wandering thoughts. Being in control has always been important to me ever since I was a kid, which is what brought me on this field trip in the first place. I was a fourth-generation Navy man, following in the illustrious footsteps of men who had served in Desert Storm, Vietnam, Korea, World War II, and World War I. But my career hadn't started as early as it could have. Annapolis may have accepted my enrollment straight out of high school, but I turned them down. Instead, much to my father's intense disapproval, I chose to attend Dartmouth to pursue a life studying histories and the classics. I'd never seen him more disappointed, and it wasn't until after I graduated that I had finally redeemed my honor in his eyes by joining the Navy. That was 5 years ago. I'd been his favorite son once again, until today. After turning down the appointment to Annapolis, I'd once wondered if my father would disown me. He hadn't, but after the events of a few hours ago, I wasn't so sure he wouldn't now. To him, boarding the C-130J Super Hercules II aircraft was paramount to high treason. I rubbed my eyes to cleanse the contentious thoughts from my mind. There was no sense in continuing to go over them in my head now. My decision was made, and the plane wouldn't turn around anyway. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. We would be in Rome soon. Commander Hunter, do you copy? My eyes snapped open, but it took me a moment to realize who was actually being addressed through my earphones. I must have dozed off. Yes, Captain, I replied, addressing the aircraft skipper. I read you Lima Charlie. Good, we'll be reaching your drop-off point soon. Keep you strapped in until we reach it. Turbulence is expected to continue. Copy. Wake me when we get there. Yes, sir, finished the captain, clicking off the intercom. Newly promoted to the rank of lieutenant commander, I couldn't help but smile, still not comfortable being addressed as sir by a captain. Navy captains were 2 ranks higher than lieutenant commanders, but Army captains were about the equivalent rank of a Navy lieutenant, which I had just been promoted from earlier today. I was barely used to hearing the formality from the men under my own command, let alone half the military. It didn't matter. I wagered that when I joined my new unit, it would be back to yes, sir, this, and no, sir, that. I suppose I couldn't complain too much. Leading men into combat was always more stressful than being responsible only for yourself and the enemy in your gun sights. 40 minutes later, the captain came over the radio again. Sir, we're minutes from drop-off. I suggest you get ready. Thank you, Captain, and thanks for the ride. No problem, sir. Good luck. Yeah, right, I mumbled. Stick jockeys always acted like they had brass balls, but I knew the only time they'd actually grow a pair and jump out of their own aircraft was when it was shot up, on fire, and dropping out of the sky like a flightless bird. And even then I questioned whether or not they actually would. Jumping out of airplanes in the middle of the night during a bad storm was generally reserved for the certifiable. And people like me, of course. The entire trip would have been far easier had I been allowed to land with the plane and walk off the ramp on a solid ground, but not today. America may have possessed military bases on the Italian peninsula that I could have used, but my trip required slightly more discretion than even your regular black op. My plane would remain on its scheduled route, but not before taking a slight detour toward my drop point. I heard a sudden whirring noise and looked to the rear of the plane, noticing the rear door begin to open, revealing a gaping maw into the dark void beyond. I tried to repress the chill I felt trickling down my spine. Getting to my feet, part of my parachute reassuringly bumping against my ass, I made my way to another member of the crew, standing near a light mounted on the hull. It was currently illuminated in red, but when it turned green, I would jump. High altitude, low opening jumps were nothing new. The first were performed by the Air Force way back in the 60s, but that didn't mean they were easy. Currently, we were traveling near our maximum altitude of around 40,000 feet. As a result, I had to carry my own oxygen supply with me on the way down. In fact, I had been sucking on a tank of 100% pure oxygen for the past half hour to help ready my circulatory system for the quick transition to the surface. Moving to the end of the craft, I bumped my head on the ceiling. Glaring at the low hull, I swore about my height for the millionth time since joining the military. I was just shy of 6.5 feet, which left me feeling cramped in practically any aircraft and pretty much ensured I'd never be a fighter pilot. I was still rubbing my head when I made my way to the crewman at the tail of the plane, who attached a carabiner to my belt, securing my small go bag on a rope so that it wouldn't get in the way. He patted me on the shoulder and threw me an OK sign with his hand. By the way, that's an OK sign. Indicating all was ready on his end. I returned the gesture with a thumbs up and pulled on my helmet, brushing my brown hair out of my eyes. Always the rebel, even as an officer, I kept my hair slightly longer than military regulations permitted. Probably something like this. I shifted my oxygen tank mask for a more comfortable fit and slid my helmet's visor into place, blinking a few times when the digital readout projected itself onto its interior. The heads-up display was just one of the fancy new Future Force Warriors items slowly being redeployed by the U.S. military. My HUD displayed numerous mission-critical details in bright blue lettering scattered around every inch of the display. It boasted items such as a clock, compass, altimeter, barometer, targeting information, GPS, and night vision capabilities. Satisfied each of its functions were working properly, I bent my legs and waited for the light. It wasn't long before it turned green and the crewman shouted, "Go, go!" I leapt into the abyss. Free falling, I quickly picked up speed. I let myself fall in a dive for a while before I allowed my arms and legs to spread out wide in a position that would allow my body to generate enough resistance against the wind to slow me down. I glanced at the upper right-hand corner of my visor, which displayed my altimeter. I watched as the meters quickly ticked away towards zero, waiting for it to indicate when I was low enough to open my chute, but still high enough to not end up as a red stain on the ground. Content I had plenty of time to burn, I tried to relax and allow myself the pleasure of enjoying the view. High enough to almost see the curve of the earth, I used my time to watch as dawn slowly crept from the east toward the inhabitants below, and the storm we had just passed through tried to meet it from the west. It was moments like these when I really loved my job. Couldn't let myself get too distracted sightseeing, however. I was already losing sight of the Mediterranean as my descent took me directly over land, alerting me it was time to start paying attention to my altimeter. I would still have to wait until I was low enough to spot an infrared beacon before I could accurately locate my exact destination, somewhere north of Rome. After a few minutes of freefall, I pulled my chute open, bracing myself as I was jerked in my harness. As the parachute opened, I reached for the toggles dangling near my head, and it wasn't long before I was in complete control and safely making my way to the ground. Activating my HUD's night vision, I glanced around in search of the beacon. Under normal eyesight, infrared was effectively invisible, but night vision had no trouble picking up the pulsating strobe that flashed brightly in the infrared spectrum. And I spotted it with little trouble, about a mile to my left, slowly began my turn and descent toward it. Nearly dirt side, I relaxed my knees and exhaled before I hit the surface. Rolling twice, I came to a stop and punched down my billowing parachute before it could lift me back in the air. Securing the cord and fabric back in its pack, I took a moment to compose myself. I shook my head to loosen my helmet's grip and leaned over to grab my go bag, which rested neatly by my feet. The small, single-shoulder hoisted rucksack held only a few soldierly essentials: my American military ID, a small multi-tool, survival kit, Surefire flashlight, Sig Sauer P220 semi-automatic pistol with 2 extra magazines, digital camera, a roll of duct tape, toiletries, and an extra pair of socks. The rest of my gear and possessions had been shipped to my destination earlier to ensure I would be ready for duty as soon as possible. Turning around, I spotted a compact black car parked next to a dirt road that snaked off into the mountains. Standing next to it was a robed man in a full-bird Army colonel. My attaché to Rome, I presumed. Reaching the car, I stopped and saluted crisply. "Lieutenant Commander Jacob Hunter reporting as ordered, Colonel." "At ease," the man said, lazily returning my salute. "My name is Colonel Reynolds. I will be your liaison with the Vatican until you have formally transferred to your new unit. When that time comes, you'll be on your own." I nodded. "Understood, Colonel. I was briefed by the President before I left Washington." Reynolds returned the gesture. He knew as well as I did how unique our situation was, one that required the highest clearance level available, and had also been overseen directly by the Commander-in-Chief. A request from the Pope was not to be taken lightly these days. He carried tremendous influence and political clout, and considering the current geopolitical situation, his title was just as influential as it had once been, centuries ago. Okay, that's about 9 minutes or so. Okay, so, a couple things obviously stand out to me. Someone once told me show, don't tell, right? You know, everyone here is as a writer, movie writer, script writer, whatever. Show, don't tell. Don't say he's 5'7". Say, or don't say he's 6'6". Say he bumped his head on the ceiling, causing him to wince in pain. But then also, I was just shy of 6'6", so I was constantly blah, blah. I know the result of a novice writer, right? I mean, even over the years, just not catching it, not paying attention to it. It is what it is. I don't love that line. I don't love a lot of the lines in there. Also, there's a lot of like, flashlight, a gun, toiletries, and people complain that there's a lot of like gun porn in this book, a lot of like military porn, as they call it. It just means that there's a lot of techno babble, but like military babble, terminology, that kind of thing. And I'm like, admittedly in the beginning there was more than what ended up in here. I cut a lot of it out. I cut a lot of stuff out, especially in this first chapter. But I left a lot of it in because, you know what, some people enjoy reading about the cool things that soldiers carry. I mean, there's a whole book called The Things They Carried about the Vietnam War, and the first chapter is dedicated to literally all the things the guy wore on his outfit in war. I mean, obviously that story in that chapter has a point to it. It's like a metaphor or whatever. You know, high school kids read it for a reason. But the point is that people do enjoy reading stuff like that. And it was funny, after I wrote this book, I found a book in the library that I worked at after college about, I don't know, it's about like the end of, the end of American civilization as we know it. And there was a, water running. We have to end this pretty quickly. It was about like the end times of American civilization and how we had to rebuild. And that book was just all weapon porn. Oh my God, every little thing. And then I kind of read it and I was like, maybe I should kind of cut some of this stuff down, honestly. So I did. What else in here? A lot of exposition, a lot of like a data dump. Not the best way to start off a story, but I did always like the whole on the plane, jumping out of the plane. I've thought about this countless times, but I always thought in my brain, like if this was made into a movie, like this is how it would go. So the prologue with Varys would happen, right? And he would close his eyes with the blue light shining on the right side of his face. And then you would hard cut to Jacob with his eyes closed, because his eyes were closed, with a red light on the left side of his face, or whichever. And then he'd get up, he'd do his thing. And there wouldn't be as much in here. It wouldn't be the talking. It would just be like the red light turns to green. That's when he's got to get up and go jump. And then as soon as he jumps, like the movie, this is just like the opening of the movie. And as soon as he jumps, cue Round, Round, Get Around by the Beach Boys, or I Get Around, or whatever it's called, by the Beach Boys. Like, round, round, get around, I get around, as he's like free falling. Because as we all know, Vincent, who we'll meet later, has a penchant for the Beach Boys, much like myself. I do love the Beach Boys. I always thought it would be a cool opening where it's kind of like the serious Roman supernatural thing, and a hard cuts to a military guy in the future. He's all serious looking. He's got his like gear on and everything. And then as soon as he jumps, just round, round, get around. I don't know. I just thought that'd be great. I think that kind of matches the tone of my book, where it's like really, it's serious, but then there's a lot of goofy moments that just kind of might be out of place a little bit. But I always thought that was great. And then obviously, like as he's jumping, there could be like not newspaper headlines, I guess, like internet headlines about the war, World War III that's going on in the story. Like that's the exposition setup. In the next reading I do, you'll probably hear me talk about the war. All that could be done with just like internet headlines, like chronicling it as he's like interspersing with cuts of him jumping. Anyways, I don't know. I always thought that'd be a great opening if there was a movie. And I have another good Beach Boys song to be used later in the book, at the very end during the battle, actually. But I'll get to that when I get to it. So yeah, I didn't read too much yet, not much set up yet. Just a guy jumping out of a plane, landing in the Italian peninsula, called by the Pope for some reason. A brief reference to the Future Force Warriors program, which probably isn't even like, I haven't even heard about it lately. It's probably like a defunct program, especially I don't know. Okay, sorry for this weird pause, but I got to wrap this up because my filming apparatus is being weird. I got to figure out a better solution going forward. Anyways, that's book one, or first part of chapter one. Catch you in the next video, YouTube.